Sherry had been hiding for a long time in the police station, for what must have been 3 or 4 days, and hadn't seen her mother yet. Not once. Not even when there had still been a lot of people left. She'd found Mrs. Addison right after she'd gotten there, one of the teachers from school. But Mrs. Addison had died. A zombie had eaten her. And not long after that, Sherry found a ventilation shaft that ran over most of the whole building and had decided that hiding was safer than staying with the grown-ups. Because the grown-ups kept dying. And because there was a monster in the station even worse than the zombies or the inside-out men. And she was pretty sure that the monster was looking for her. That was probably stupid. She didn't think that monsters picked out just one person to go for, but then again, she'd never thought that monsters were real either. So Sherry had stayed hidden, mostly in the night room. There weren't any dead people there, and the only way to get in, besides the ventilation shaft behind the suits of armor, was to go down a long hall guarded by a giant tiger. The tiger was stuffed, but it was still scary, and Sherry thought that maybe the tiger would scare away the monster. Part of her knew that was dumb, but it made her feel better anyway. Since the zombies had taken over everything in the police station, she'd spent a lot of time sleeping. When she was asleep, she didn't have to think about what might have happened to her parents, or worry about what was going to happen to her. The air shaft was pretty warm, and she had plenty to eat from the candy machines downstairs, but she was scared. And even worse than being scared was being lonely. So mostly she just slept. She'd been asleep, warm and curled up behind the nights, when she'd been awakened by a tremendous crash somewhere outside. She was sure it was the monster. She'd only caught a glimpse of it once before, of the giant's broad and terrible back through a steel grate. But she'd heard it screaming and howling through the building many times since then. She knew that it was terrible. Terrible and violent and hungry. Sometimes it disappeared for hours at a time, letting her hope that it had given up. But it always came back. And no matter where Sherry was, it always seemed to appear somewhere close by. The loud noise that had ripped her from her dreamless sleep was like the sound a monster would make tearing the walls down, and she'd hurried in her hiding place, ready to dart back into the shaft if the sound came any closer. It didn't. For a long time she didn't move, waiting with her eyes squinted shut, holding on to a good luck charm, a beautiful gold pennant that her mother had given her only last week, so big that it filled up her whole hand. As it had before, the charm worked. The loud, terrible noises hadn't been repeated. Or maybe the big tiger had kept the monster from finding her. Either way, when she'd heard the gentle thumping sounds in the office, she'd felt safe enough to creep out of the case and go out into the hall to listen. The zombies and inside-out men couldn't use doors, and if it was the monster, it would have come for her already, clawing down doors and screaming for blood. It has to be a person. Maybe Mom. Halfway down the hall, where it turned right, she'd heard people talking in the office and felt a burst of hope and loneliness mixed together. She couldn't tell what they were saying, but it was the first time she'd heard anybody who wasn't yelling for maybe 2 days. And if there were people talking, maybe it was because help had finally come to Raccoon. the army or the government or the Marines, maybe all of them. Excited, she hurried down the hall and was next to the big snarling tiger, right by the door, when her excitement faltered. The voices had stopped. Sherry stood very still, suddenly anxious. If people had come to Raccoon to help, wouldn't she have heard planes and trucks? Wouldn't there be shooting and bombs and men with loudspeakers telling everybody to come out? Maybe those voices aren't army people at all. Maybe those voices are bad people. Crazy, like that one man. Not long after Sherry had gone into hiding, she'd seen a terrible thing through a grating that led into a locker room. A tall man with red hair had been in the room, talking to himself and rocking back and forth in a chair. At first, Sherry had thought about asking him for help to find her parents, but something about the way he was talking and giggling, gently swaying back and forth, made her wary. So she'd watched him for a while from the safe darkness of the air shaft. He'd been holding a big knife, and after a long time, still laughing and mumbling and rocking, he'd stabbed himself in the stomach. Sherry had been more scared by that man than by the zombies, because it didn't make sense. He'd been crazy, and he'd killed himself, and she crawled away, crying because it just didn't make any sense. She didn't want to meet anyone else like that. And even if the people in the office were okay, they might take her away from her safe place and try to protect her. And that would mean her death, because the monster surely wasn't afraid of adults. It felt awful to turn away, but there was no other choice. Sherry started back for the armor room and froze as the floor shifted underfoot. The sound of the creaking board seemed incredibly loud, and she held her breath, clutching her pendant and praying that the door wouldn't come flying open behind her, that some crazy wouldn't charge in and get her. She didn't hear anything, but felt sure that the pounding of her heart would give her away. It was so loud. After a full 10 seconds, she carefully started back down the hall, stepping as lightly as she could, feeling like she was creeping out of a cave filled with sleeping snakes. The hall back to the armor room seemed like it was a mile long, and she had to use all of her willpower not to run once she'd reached the turn. But if there was one thing she'd learned from movies and TV, it was that running from danger always meant a horrible death. When she finally reached the entrance back to the armor room, she felt like she might just collapse from relief. She was safe again. She could snuggle back into the old blanket that Mrs. Addison had found for her in just... The door from the office opened and closed. A second later, there were footsteps coming for her. Sherry flew into the armor room, no longer thinking about anything at all in the bright and trembling crush of panic that swept through her. She sprinted past the 3 knights, forgetting her safe place because all she knew was that she had to get away, get as far away as possible. There was a dark, tiny chamber past the glass case in the middle of the room, and darkness was what she needed, a shadow to disappear into. And she could hear the running footsteps somewhere behind her, pounding over wood as she hurtled into the dark room and into the furthest corner.
Sherry crouched down between the dusty brick of the room's fireplace and the padded chair beside it and tried to make herself as small as possible, hugging her knees and hiding her face. The running footsteps had come into the armor room and were slow now, hesitant, moving around the big glass case in the middle. Sherry thought of her safe place, the mouth of the ventilation shaft that could have taken her away, and struggled to hold back hot tears of self-condemnation. The fireplace room had no escape. She was trapped. Each hollow, thumping step brought the stranger closer to the dark room in which Sherry hid. She scrunched herself tighter, making promises that she would do anything at all if only the stranger would go away. Suddenly, the room flashed into blinding brightness, the soft click of the light switch lost beneath Sherry's terrified cry. She pushed away from her corner and ran, screaming and unseen, hoping to get past the stranger and back into the air shaft. And a warm hand grabbed her arm, tight, keeping her from going one more step. She screamed again, jerking as hard as she could, but the stranger was strong. "Wait!" It was a lady, the voice almost as frantic as Sherry's hammering heart. "Let me go!" Sherry wailed, but the lady was still holding on, even pulling her closer. "Easy, easy, I'm not a zombie. Take it easy. It's okay." The woman's voice had turned soothing. The words crooned gently, the hand on Sherry's wrist warm and strong. The sweet musical voice repeated the gentle words again and again. "Easy. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe now." Sherry finally looked at the lady and saw how pretty she was, how her eyes were soft with concern and sympathy. And just like that, Sherry stopped trying to get away and felt the hot tears trickle down her face, tears that she'd been holding back ever since she'd seen the red-haired man commit suicide. She instinctively hugged the young, pretty stranger, and the lady hugged her back, her slender arms tight across Sherry's trembling shoulders. Sherry cried for a couple of minutes, letting the woman stroke her hair and whisper soothing words to her, and at last she felt like the worst was over. As much as she wanted to crawl into the lady's arms and forget all of her fears, to believe that she was safe, she knew better. And besides, she wasn't a baby anymore. She turned 12 last month. With an effort, Sherry stepped away from the woman and wiped her eyes, looking up into her pretty face. The woman wasn't that old, maybe only 20 or so, and was dressed really cool. Boots and cut-off pink denim shorts and a matching vest with no sleeves. She wore her shiny brown hair in a ponytail, and when she smiled, she looked like a movie star. The woman crouched down right in front of her, still smiling gently. "My name's Claire. What's yours?" Sherry felt shy suddenly, embarrassed for running and then trying to get away from such a nice lady. Her parents had often told her that she acted like an emotional baby, that she was too imaginative for her own good. And here was proof. Claire wasn't going to hurt her. She could tell. "Sherry Birkin," she said, and smiled at Claire, hoping that Claire wasn't mad at her. She didn't look mad. In fact, she looked pleased with Sherry's answer. "Do you know where your parents are?" Claire asked. "They work at the Umbrella chemical plant, just outside of town." "Chemical plant?" Then what are you doing here? My mum called and told me to go to the police station. She said it was too dangerous to stay at home. Claire nodded. From the look of things, she was probably right. But it's dangerous here as well. Claire frowned thoughtfully, then smiled again. You'd better come with me. Sherry felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach and shook her head, wondering how to explain to Claire that it wasn't a good idea, that it was a very bad idea. She wanted more than anything not to be alone anymore, but it just wasn't safe. Claire would be killed. And although Claire was thin, Sherry was pretty sure that she wouldn't be able to fit in the ventilation shaft. There's something out there, she said finally. I saw it. It's bigger than the zombies, and it's coming after me. Claire shook her head, opening her mouth to say something, probably to try and talk her into changing her mind, when a terrible, furious sound filled the room, echoing in violent waves from somewhere in the building, somewhere close. Sherry felt her blood turn to ice. Claire's eyes went wide, her skin paling. What was that? Sherry backed away, breathless, in her mind already running for the safe place behind the 3 suits of armor. That's what I was telling you, she gasped. And before Claire could stop her, she turned and ran. Sherry! Sherry ignored the shouted plea, sprinting past the glass exhibit case for the safety of the air shaft. She leapt nimbly over the knight's pedestal and dropped to her hands and knees, ducking her head and scrambling into the ancient stone hole set into the base of the wall. Her only chance, Claire's only chance, was for Sherry to get as far away from her as possible. Maybe they would find each other again when the monster had gone. As Sherry crawled quickly through the tight and winding darkness, she hoped it wasn't already too late. Ada sat on the edge of the cluttered desk in the office of the chief of detectives, resting her aching feet and staring blankly at the empty steel safe in the corner. Her patience was wearing thin. Not only was the G-virus sample nowhere to be found, she was starting to think that Bertolucci had flown the coop. She'd gone through the break room, the STARS office, the library. In fact, she was pretty sure she'd covered just about everywhere the reporter would have easy access to, and had used 2 full clips to do it. It wasn't that she was low on ammo. It was the waste of time the bullets represented. 26 rounds and no results, except that there were a dozen more virus-riddled corpses lying around, and 2 of Umbrella's freak hybrids. Ada shuddered, remembering the warped red flesh and trumpeting shrieks of the bizarre creatures that she'd capped in the press room. She'd never been particularly bothered by greed, corporate or otherwise, but Umbrella had been up to some seriously immoral experimentation. Trent had warned her about the tyrant retrievers, which thankfully hadn't put in an appearance yet. But the long-tongued, clawed, bloody humanoids were an affront to even her sensibilities. Not to mention a lot harder to kill than the virus carriers. If they were T-virus products, she'd have to keep her fingers crossed that Birkin hadn't done anything with his newest creation. According to Trent, the G-series hadn't been put to use yet, but it was supposed to be twice as potent. Ada let her gaze wander, taking in the plain, functional office. It wasn't the most inspiring environment to take a break in, but at least it was reasonably gore-free. With the door closed, she could hardly smell the officers in the main part of the room. They'd been pretty far gone when she'd put them down, that bonelessly wet stage that apparently preceded total collapse. Not that it matters if I can smell them. My hair and clothes have absorbed the goddamn smell. When they start to go bad, it seems to happen with a bang. She wished she'd bothered to learn more on the science end. She knew what the T-virus was used for, but hadn't thought it necessary to research the physiochemical effects. Why bother when she had no reason to think that Umbrella had been planning to spill a shitload of it in their hometown? She was getting plenty of first-hand information about how well it worked, but it would have been nice to know exactly what happened in the infected party's body and mind, what turned them from a person into a mindless flesh-eater. Instead, she could only file away her observations and make guesses at the truth. From what she'd seen, it took less than an hour for someone infected to turn zombie. Sometimes the victims went into a kind of fever coma first, which presumably burnt out parts of the brain and only added to the impression that they were waking from the dead when they stood up and started looking for fresh meat. The symptoms of the virus were the same for everyone, but not the progression rate. She'd seen at least 3 cases where the victim had turned bloodthirsty within a couple of moments of being infected, the stage she'd started to think of as going cataract. One of the few constants was that their eyes clouded with a thin film of eggy white mucus when they turned, and although the physical deterioration always started immediately, some fell to pieces much faster than others. And why are you thinking about it? Your job doesn't include finding a cure, now does it? She sighed, bending over to rub her toes. True enough. Still, it was something to think about. Focusing on staying alive was tiring and all-encompassing work. She didn't have a chance to consider the subtleties of the circumstances while clearing out corridors. She was on break, and she needed to let her brain run around a bit, ponder a few of the job's more puzzling aspects. There are about 1,000 to mull over. Trent, what Bertolucci should or shouldn't know, and the stars. What the hell had happened to the merry crew? From the article that Trent had included in the info packet, she knew about the stars' suspension, and considering what they'd been investigating, it didn't take a genius to figure out that they'd been railroaded by Umbrella for uncovering part, if not all, of the bioweapons operation. Umbrella had probably offed them by now if they hadn't gone into hiding, and she had to wonder if Trent had played any part in the Stars' little misadventure, or if he'd tried to contact them before or after. Not that he would have told her. Trent was an enigma, to be sure. She'd only had one actual meeting with him, although he'd contacted her several times prior to her leaving for Raccoon, mostly by phone. And although she always prided herself on her ability to read people, she knew absolutely nothing about where his interests lay, why he wanted the G-Virus, or what his gripe with Umbrella was about. It was obvious that he had some inside connection. He knew too much about the company's workings. But if that was the case, why not just pick up his own goddamn sample and then quit? hiring an outside agent was the act of someone trying to avoid implication. But implication of what? Ours is not to question why. A good principle to live by. She also wasn't getting paid to figure out Trent. She doubted she'd be able to, even if she was getting paid for it. She'd never met such a supremely self-controlled man as Mr. Trent. In every interaction they'd had, she'd gotten the feeling that he had been smiling inside, as if he knew some intensely pleasurable secret that no one else was privy to, and yet somehow he hadn't come across as arrogant or overblown. He was a cool one, his geniality so natural that she'd been vaguely intimidated. She might not have been able to pick up on his motives, but she'd seen that calm humor before. 'Twas the real face of true power, of a man with a plan and the means to implement it. So had the spill upset his plans, whatever they are, or was he prepared for this? He may not have planned it, but I can't imagine that caught unawares is anywhere in Trent's vocabulary. Ada leaned back, rolling her head tiredly before pushing herself off the desk and stepping back into her uncomfortable shoes. Enough downtime. She couldn't spare her aches and pains more than a few minutes and didn't expect to figure out much of anything until she was well away from Raccoon. She still had a couple of areas to check for Bertolucci before heading into the sewers, and she'd noticed that some of the first-floor window barricades weren't as solid as she might have hoped. She didn't want to end up blocked out of a path by a new group of carriers from outside. There were the secret passages on the east side and the holding cells downstairs past the parking garage. If she couldn't find him in either of those places, she'd have to assume that he'd left the station and concentrate her efforts on obtaining the sample. She decided to try the basement first. It seemed unlikely that he'd stumbled across the hidden corridors. From what she'd read of his work, he wasn't a good enough reporter to find his own ass. And if he was hiding in or near the holding cells, she wouldn't have to spend any more time roaming the station, facing the inevitable invasion. The entrance into the sub-basement was downstairs, so, barring any complications, she could head straight for the lab. Ada walked out of the office, wrinkling her nose at the fresh burst of rotting smell pushed at her by the lazily spinning ceiling fans. There had to be 7 or 8 bodies in the desk-filled room, all of them cops, and at least the 3 she'd shot had been fairly rank. And didn't I leave 5 carriers still walking around in here when I came through before? Ada paused just outside the large and open room, looking back in from the narrow connecting corridor that led to the back stairs. Had there been 5? She knew she'd capped a couple on her first visit. The rest had been too slow to hassle with, and she thought there'd been 5 of them. And yet she'd only had to knock off 3 when she had returned from her impromptu break. There were 5. I may not be at peak, but I can still count. She wasn't in the habit of doubting her ability to keep track of such things, and the fact that she'd only just noticed was a sign of how tired she was. 2 days ago, she would have made this observation immediately. There was no way to tell if the additional corpses had been shot or had simply disintegrated on their own without exposing herself to contact. They were too messed up. But it would be wisest to assume that there were still a few survivors wandering around. Not for long, one way or another. Whether or not the zombies managed to break through, Umbrella would act soon, if they hadn't already. What had happened in Raccoon was a shareholder's worst nightmare, and Umbrella certainly wasn't going to ignore the problem. They'd probably already worked up a fail-safe disaster and prepared their own spin to feed the press. And it was a foregone conclusion that they'd try to salvage Birkin's synthesis before putting their failsafe into effect, which meant that she'd have to be very careful. Birkin had apparently been somewhat secretive about his work, and Trent had relayed that Umbrella would eventually send in a retrieval team. With Raccoon in ashes, that eventuality had probably been moved forward a few notches. A team of human beings, hopefully. I can handle that. A tyrant, though. I don't need that kind of pain. Ada turned away from the room, walking toward the closed door that would lead her to the basement steps. Tyrant was the code name for a particular series in Umbrella's organic weapons research, a series that embodied the most destructive applications of the T-virus. According to Trent, the White Umbrella scientists, the ones working in the secret labs, had just started tests on a kind of humanoid bloodhound designed to hunt down any assigned scent or substance it had been encoded for with relentless and inhuman capabilities. A tyrant retriever, a nearly indestructible construct of infected flesh and surgically implanted wiring. Just the kind of thing that they might send in to find, say, a sample of the G-virus. Once she'd collected Trent's samples, she was history, paid and drinking margaritas on a beach somewhere. And anything she might or might not feel about it, about how many innocents had died or what Trent wanted the G-virus for, it was just one more thing to put on her list of things the job didn't call for. Her defenses safely in place, Ada started for the basement to see if she could find the troublesome reporter. Leon stood in the ransacked basement weapons locker, adjusting the holster straps and thinking about where Claire might be. From what little he'd seen so far, the station wasn't too bad. Cold and dim and stinking of the bodies heaped in the hallways, but not as actively dangerous as the streets. It wasn't much to be grateful for, but he'd take what he can get. He'd killed 2 of his fellow officers and a woman in the tatters of a traffic patrol uniform on his way to the basement. The cops upstairs and the woman just outside the morgue, a few yards from the small room that housed the RPD armament. Only 3 zombies since he'd reached the station, not including the few he'd been able to avoid in the detective's room, but he'd passed over a dozen corpses on the short journey and had been able to make out the bullet holes on about half of them, through the eyes or directly to the temple. Between the cleanly dispatched creatures and the number of weapons missing from the locker, he dared to hope that Brannig had been right about there being survivors.
Marvin Brannig. Probably dead by now. Does that mean he'll turn into a zombie? If Umbrella's really behind all this, it has to be some kind of a plague or disease. They're a pharmaceutical company. So how do you catch it? Is it a contact thing, or can you get it from taking a deep breath? Leon dropped that train of thought fast. As cool and humid as the basement was, the thought that he could be infected by the zombie sickness made him break out in a sudden feverish sweat. What if Olive Raccoon was still hot, and he'd caught it just driving into town? The cluttered shelves of the storage room seemed to close in just a bit, in an anxiety flash of epic proportions. But before real panic set in, he heard his mind's voice remind him of the reality, and the acceptance of the reality came with it, allowing him to let go of the fear. Well, if you're sick, you're sick. You can eat a bullet before it gets bad. If you're not sick, maybe you can survive to tell your grandkids about all this. Either way, there's probably nothing you can do about it now, except try to be a cop. Leon nodded to himself, sighing. A better plan than worrying about it, and he now had the equipment to boost his chances. The electronic lock for the weapons store had been shot through, saving him from having to go searching for a keycard or shooting it himself. The door had obviously been pried open, the external locks and handle practically shredded. On his first dig through the room, he'd been disappointed and not a little freaked. There had been no handguns at all, and very little ammo left in the dented green lockers. But he had found a box of shotgun shells, and after a second more desperately thorough search, he'd uncovered a 12-gauge hidden behind a high stack of boxes. There were a couple of shoulder harnesses for the Remington model still hanging on the wall hook, as well as the bigger utility belt than the one he already wore. It even had a side pack deep enough to hold all of the loaded magnum clips. With a final cinch of the harness, he decided that it would be best to start searching the most obvious places first, every connecting corridor from every possible entrance. He'd head back to the lobby first, find something to leave a note on. Shots fired! Close! And the echoing tones said it was the garage just down the hall. Leon yanked the magnum out and ran for the door, precious seconds wasted as he fumbled at the mangled handle. The hall was clear, except for the dead traffic cop on the floor to his right. Straight ahead was the entrance to the parking garage, and Leon hurried toward it, reminding himself that he wanted to go in easy, that he didn't want to get shot by a panicked gunman. Take it slow. Get a good look before you move. The door, set into the wall to his right, was standing open, and as Leon darted a look into the wide and open space, he saw something that startled him into forgetting about the shooter. The dog. It's the same dog. Impossible. But the sprawled, lifeless animal in the middle of the car-lined chamber looked the same. Even with the barest glimpse he'd had before, the slimy wet demon in canine form that had nearly scared him into a car crash 10 miles outside the city could have come from the same litter. Beneath the sputtering fluorescent strips that lit the cold, oil-stained garage, Leon could see how truly abnormal it was.
There didn't seem to be anything moving and no sound except for the buzz of lights. Still holding the magnum ready, Leon stepped into the garage, determined to get a closer look at the creature, and saw a second one next to a parked squad car, apparently just as dead. Both lay in sticky red pools of their own blood, their long, skinned-looking limbs splayed brokenly. Umbrella. The wild animal attacks. The disease. How long has this shit been going on? And how did they manage to keep it quiet after all those murders? What was even more confusing was why Raccoon wasn't crawling with support services already. Umbrella may have been able to keep their involvement with the cannibal murders silent, but how could they keep Raccoon citizens from calling for help from outside the city? And these dogs, like carbon copies. Something else that Umbrella made up in their labs? He took another step towards the fallen dog things, frowning, not liking the dark conspiracy theories that were forming in his thoughts, but unable to ignore them. What he liked even less was the look of the oil stains on the concrete floor. They were rust-colored, and there were too many of the dried splotches for him to count. He bent down to get a closer look, so intent on putting to rest a sudden terrible suspicion that he didn't register the shot until he heard the high-singing whine when the bullet flew past his head. Leon spun left, bringing the magnum up and shouting at the same time, "Hold your fire!" And he saw the shooter lowering her weapon. A woman in a short red dress and black leggings, standing by the van, against the far wall. She started walking toward him, her slender hips rolling smoothly, her head high and shoulders back, as if they were at a cocktail party. Leon felt a rush of anger that she could seem so calm after nearly killing him. But as she got closer, he found himself wanting to forgive her. She was beautiful, and wore an expression of genuine pleasure at seeing him. A welcome sight after so much death. "Sorry about that," she said. "When I saw the uniform, I thought you were another zombie." She was Asian American, fine-boned but tall, her short hair thick and glossy black. Her deep, satiny voice was almost a purr, a strange contrast to the way she looked at him. The slight smile she wore didn't seem to touch her almond-shaped eyes, which were scrutinizing him carefully. "Who are you?" Leon asked. "Ada Wong." That throaty purr again. She tilted her head, still smiling. "I'm Leon Kennedy," he said reflexively, not sure what to ask or where to start. "What are you doing down here?" Ada nodded toward the van behind her, an RPD transport wagon that was blocking the holding cell area. "I came to Raccoon looking for a man, a reporter named Bertolucci. I have reason to think that he's in one of the cells, and I think he might be able to help me find my boyfriend." Her smile faded, her sharp, almost electric gaze meeting his. "And I think he knows all about what happened here. Would you help me move the van?" If there was a reporter locked up on the other side of the garage wall who could tell them anything at all, Leon was eager to meet him. He wasn't sure what to make of Ada's story, but couldn't imagine why she would lie about anything. The station wasn't safe, and she was looking for survivors, just as he was. "Yeah, okay," he said, feeling caught off guard by her smoothly direct manner. It felt like she had taken control of their meeting, some subtle but deliberate manipulation that had put her in charge, and from the casual way she turned and walked back to the van, as if there was no question that he would follow. He thought she knew it. Don't be paranoid. Strong women do exist, and the more people we can find, the more help I can get to look for Claire. Maybe it was time to stop making plans and just try to keep up. Leon bolstered the Magnum and went after her, hoping that the reporter was where Ada thought he was, and that things would start making sense sooner, rather than later. Sherry Birkin was gone, and Claire couldn't fit herself into the ventilation duct to go after her. Whatever or whoever had screamed and scared the little girl so badly hadn't put in an appearance, but Sherry was history, maybe still crawling frantically through some dark and dusty tunnel. She had apparently been hiding by the duct for a while. There were empty candy bar wrappers and a musty old blanket stuffed in the opening. The pathetic little hideaway tucked behind 3 standing suits of armor. Once she'd realized that Sherry wasn't coming back, Claire had hurried back to Ian's office, hoping that he might be able to tell her where the duct let out. But Ian's was gone, along with the body of the mayor's daughter. Claire stood in the office, watched over by the dumb glass eyes of the morbid decor, and felt really uncertain for the first time since she'd hit town. She'd started out to find Chris, a goal that had expanded to include worries about zombie dodging, hooking up with Leon, and avoiding creepy Chief Irons. Pretty much in that order. But in the few moments between meeting the little girl and that strange howling scream, her priorities had shifted dramatically. A child was caught up in this nightmare. A sweet, innocent kid who believed that there was a monster stalking her. Maybe there is. If I can accept that raccoons got zombies, why not monsters? Hell, why not vampires or killer robots? She wanted to find Sherry, and she didn't know how to start. She wanted her big brother, but was just as clueless as to where he might be. And she had begun to wonder if he knew anything about what had happened to Raccoon. The last time she'd talked to him, he'd avoided her questions about why the stars had been suspended, insisting that it wasn't anything to worry about, that he and the team had run into some political trouble at the office, and it was all going to be sorted out. She was used to his protectiveness, but thinking back, hadn't he seemed overly evasive? And the stars had been investigating the cannibal murders. It wasn't much of a stretch to connect the past flesh-eating activity with the current. Which means what? That Chris uncovered some evil plot and was hiding it? She didn't know. All that she knew was that she didn't believe he was dead, and that for now, finding Chris or Leon would have to take a back seat to finding Sherry. As bad as things were, Claire had defenses. She had a gun. she had at least a little emotional maturity, and after nearly 2 years of daily 5-mile runs, she was in excellent shape. But Sherry Birkin couldn't be older than 11 or 12, and seemed frail in every sense of the word, from the dirt in her pixie blonde hair to the desperate anxiety in her wide blue eyes. She had inspired all of Claire's protective instincts. A heavy, hollow vibration rattled through the ceiling, making the intricate chandelier in Ian's office tremble. Claire reflexively looked up, gripping her handgun. There was nothing to see but wood and plaster, and the sound didn't repeat itself. Something on the roof. But what could have made a noise like that? An elephant being airdropped? Maybe it was Sherry's monster. The vicious scream they'd heard back in the private exhibit room had come through a duct or the fireplace. The origin of the cry impossible to pin down. But it could have been the roof. Claire wasn't particularly keen on meeting up with whatever had screamed, but Sherry had seemed certain that the creature was following her. So find the screamer, find the girl. Not my idea of the perfect plan, but I don't have much else to go on at this point. Might be the only way to find her. Or maybe it was Ian's up there, and although her meeting with him had left a slimy taste in her mouth, she regretted not having tried to get more information out of him. Crazy or not, he hadn't struck her as stupid, and it might not be a bad idea to find him again. At least to ask some questions about the ventilation system. She wouldn't know anything until she checked it out. Claire turned and went to the office door that opened into the outer corridor, where she'd put out the helicopter fire. The smoke had thinned in the adjoining hall, and although the air was still warm, it wasn't the heat of a fresh blaze. In that, at least, she'd been successful. Claire stepped back into the main hall, averting her eyes from what was left of the pilot, and she froze as she heard a massive splintering of wood, followed by the thick, ponderous steps of someone who must be huge, moving through the corridor, past the turn. The sounds deliberate and thundering. Claire shot a look back down the small hallway to Ian's office, her instincts telling her to run, her brain reminding her that it was a dead end, her body paralyzed between the two when the biggest man she'd ever seen stepped into view, shadowed by the thin haze of smoke drifting through the hall. He was dressed in a long army green overcoat that only accentuated his size. He was as tall as an NBA star. Taller, but with proportionate bulk. A thick utility belt was wrapped around his waist, and though she didn't see any weapons, she could feel the violence radiating off him in invisible waves. She could just make out his sickly white blur of a face, the hairless sloping skull, and quite suddenly Claire was certain that he was a monster, a killer with black-gloved fists, each as big as her human head. "Shoot it! Shoot it!" Claire aimed but hesitated, terrified of making a horrible mistake, until it took one massive step toward her on tree-trunk legs, and she heard the crunch of dented wood beneath its booted Frankenstein feet, and saw the black eyes, black and rimmed with red like lava-filled pits in a misshapen white boulder, blank but not at all blind. His gaze found her, and he raised one meaty, clenched fist, the threat unmistakable. She squeezed the trigger, 1, 2 times, and saw the impact. A flap of its lapel blew into shards just below its collarbone, the second shot slicing cleanly through one side of the neck. And he took another step. Not a flicker of expression passing over his rough-hewn features. The fist still raised, seeking a target, seeking to crush. In a rush of adrenaline-boosted dread, Claire pointed the handgun at the creature's heart and pulled the trigger repeatedly, the giant taking another step, striding into the stream of explosive fire without flinching. And she lost track of the shots, unable to believe that it could still be coming, less than 10 feet away as the rounds hammered its mammoth chest. And the gun clicked empty. The monster stopped in its thundering tracks, swaying from side to side like a tall building in a high wind. Without taking her shocked gaze from the reeling giant, Claire grabbed another clip from her vest and fumbled through reloading, her brain crazily trying to name this walking abortion. Terminator, Frankenstein's monster, Dr. Evil, Mr. X. Whatever it was supposed to be, the 7+ semi-jacketed rounds to the chest had finally taken effect. Silently, the towering creature slumped to his right, falling heavily against one smoke-blackened wall and sagging there. Not crumpling, but not moving either. Weird angle, that's all. He's dead, just propped up by his own weight. Claire didn't move any closer, keeping the handgun leveled at the motionless giant. Was this the screamer? For as powerful and inhuman as it looked, she didn't think so. This was no primal, furious demon howling for blood. Mr. X was more like some soulless machine, bloodless flesh that could ignore pain or embrace it. Dead now, doesn't matter, Claire whispered, as much to reassure herself as to cut off the relentless stream of useless thought. She had to think, to figure out what this meant. This wasn't some freak zombie mutation. So what the hell was it? Why didn't it fall down? She'd emptied a mostly full clip. Would somebody hear the shots? Would Sherry or Irons or Leon or whoever else might be looking around the station come find her? Should she stay where she was? The creature that she'd already started to think of as Mr. X wasn't breathing, its muscular body perfectly still, its face as closed as death. Claire bit her lower lip, staring at the still impossibly standing, leaning creature, trying to think through her confused fear. And then she saw his eyes open, his shiny black and red eyes. Without so much as a wince of pain or effort, Mr. X swayed back to his stand, blocking the hall, his giant hands rising again. And with a mighty swing, he crashed his fist through the air, his long arms whipping just in front of her as she stumbled back. The momentum was enough for both of his huge hands to plunge into the wall across from where he'd leaned. The impact buried his fists, his arms stuck in the wood and plaster halfway to his elbows. Me. Could have been me.
back through Iron's office, and she'd be trapped. Without giving the matter any further thought, Claire moved, sprinting towards Mr. X. She flew past him, her right arm actually brushing against his heavy coat, her heart skipping a beat as the material wisped across her skin. She ran, hung a left, and dashed down the hazy hall, trying to remember what was past the waiting room, trying not to hear the unmistakable sounds of movement behind her as Mr. X jerked his hands free. Jesus, what was that thing? Back through the waiting room, slamming the door behind her as she ran, Claire decided that she would decide later. She ran, not letting herself think anything at all but how to run faster. Ben Bertolucci was in the last cell in the room furthest from the garage, crashed out on a metal cot and snoring lightly. Keeping her expression carefully neutral, Ada decided to let Leon wake him up. She didn't want to seem overly eager, and if there was one thing she knew about men, it was that they were easier to handle when they thought they were in control. Ada looked up at Leon with a patience she didn't feel and waited. They checked out an empty kennel in a winding concrete hall before finding him. And though the cold, dank air reeked of blood and virus decay, they hadn't come across any bodies, which was strange considering the slaughter that Ada knew had occurred in the dank garage. She thought about asking Leon if he knew what had happened, but decided the less they spoke, the better. There was no point in letting him get used to having her around. She'd seen the manhole in the kennel, rusting and set into a dark corner, and had been gratified to see a crowbar on an open shelf nearby. With Bertolucci snoozing in front of them, Ada felt like things were finally starting to pick up. "Let me guess," Leon said loudly and reached out to thump on the metal bars with the butt of his gun. "You must be Bertolucci, right? Get up." Bertolucci groaned and sat up slowly, rubbing at his stubbled jaw. Ada wanted to smile. Watching him frown wearily in their direction, he looked like shit. His clothes rumpled, his lank bony tail frazzled. Still wearing his tie, though. The poor slob probably thinks it makes him look more like a real reporter. "What do you want? Trying to sleep here." He sounded grouchy, and again Ada had to suppress a smile. It served him right for being so difficult to find. Leah glanced at Ada, looking a trifle uncertain. "Is this the guy?" She nodded, realizing that Leon probably thought Bertolucci was a prisoner. Their conversation would dispel that particular notion pretty fast, but she didn't want Leon to know more than he had to. She'd have to choose her words carefully. "Ben," she said, letting her voice carry a hint of desperation, "you told the city officials that you knew something about what's been going on, didn't you? What did you tell them?" Bertolucci stood up and glared at her, his lips curling. "And who the hell are you?" Pretending that she hadn't heard, Ada upped the desperation, but just a hair. She didn't want to overplay the helpless female bit. It kind of clashed with the fact that she'd survived this long. "I'm trying to find a friend of mine, John Howe. He was working for a branch office of Umbrella based in Chicago, but he disappeared several months ago, and I heard a rumor that he's here, in this city." She trailed off, watching Bertolucci's expression. He knew something, no question, but she didn't think he was
going to give it up. "I don't know anything," he said gruffly. "And even if I did, why would I want to tell you?" Original. If the cop wasn't here, I'd probably just shoot him. Actually, she probably wouldn't. Ada wasn't into killing for the fun of it, and thought that she could probably get it out of him using one of her more persuasive methods. If her feminine charms didn't work, there was always a shot to the kneecap. Unfortunately, she couldn't do anything with Officer Leon hanging around. She hadn't planned on their encounter, but for a moment she was stuck with him. The cop obviously wasn't happy with the reporter's responses. "Okay, well, I say we leave him in there," he growled, talking to Ada but staring at Bertolucci with undisguised irritation. Bertolucci half smiled, reaching into one pocket and pulling out a set of silver cell keys on a thick ring. Ada wasn't surprised, but Leon looked even more pissed off. "Fine by me," Bertolucci said smugly. "I'm not about to leave this cell anyways. It's the safest place in the building. There are more than just zombies running around here. Believe you me." From the way he said it, Ada thought she'd probably have to kill him after all. Trent's instructions had been clear. If Bertolucci knew anything about Birkin's work on the G-Virus, he was to be disposed of. Why exactly, she wasn't sure, but that was the job. If she could just get a few moments alone with him, she'd be able to ascertain how much he actually knew. The question was, how? She didn't want to shoot Leon. As a rule, she didn't kill innocents, and besides, she liked cops. Not necessarily the brightest lot, but anyone who took a job that required putting his or her life on the line had her respect. And he had great taste in weaponry. The Desert Eagle was top of the line. So why rationalize? I ditch him first and then circle back. Doesn't mean I'm going soft. A violent, inhumane shriek pierced the tense silence. Ada snapped her Beretta around, aiming at the open gate that led back through the empty cell block area. Whatever it was somewhere in the basement. "What was that?" Leon breathed from behind her, and Ada wished she knew the answer. The still resonating echo of the furious scream was like nothing she'd heard before, and nothing she expected to hear, even knowing about Umbrella's research. "Like I said, I'm not leaving this cell," Bertolucci said, his voice breaking slightly. "Now get out of here before you lead it right to me." Sniveling coward. "Look, I may be the only cop left alive in this building," Leon said, and something about the combination of fear and strength in his tone made Ada shoot a look back at him. The officer's gaze was fixed on Bertolucci, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "So if you want to live, you're gonna have to come with us." "Forget it," Bertolucci snapped. "I'm staying here till the cavalry shows up. If you're smart, you'll do the same." Leon shook his head. "It could be days before anyone comes. Our best chance is to find a way out of Raccoon. And you heard that scream. Do you really want to get a visit from whatever made it?" She was impressed. Some Umbrella freak could be lurching its way toward them even now. And Leon was actually trying to save the reporter's worthless hide. "I'll take the risk," said Bertolucci. "And good luck getting out. You're gonna need it."
The rumpled reporter stepped up to the bars, looking back and forth between them, running a hand over his greasy hair. "Look," he said, his voice softening. "There's a kennel in the back of the building with a manhole in it. You can get to the sewers from there. It's probably the fastest way out of the city." Ada sighed inwardly. Terrific. So much for her hidden route to the lab. If she dumped Leon now, it would take him about 5 minutes to find her. You can always kill him if it comes to that, or you can get him lost in the sewers and come back for Bertolucci while he's clearing the path for you. Unlike Bertolucci, she didn't want to run into whatever had screamed, and now that she knew he was staying put, luring the cop away was the next logical step. The things I do to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. "All right," she said. "I'm going to check it out." And without waiting for Leon's response, she turned and sprinted for the gate. "Ada, wait!" She ignored him, hurrying past the empty cells and back into the chilled hall, relieved that the passage was still clear and feeling a little unnerved by her sudden reluctance to simplify the situation. Things would be a lot easier if she just got rid of them both. A decision she wouldn't have hesitated to make under different circumstances. But she was sick of death. Sick and tired and disgusted with Umbrella for what they'd done. She wasn't going to take the cop out unless she had to. And if she did have to? If it came down to some innocent's life or completing the job, that she could ask herself that question at all told her more about her state of mind than she wanted to admit. She'd reached the door to the kennel. Ada took a deep breath, forcing every twinge of nagging emotion from her thoughts, and stepped inside to wait for Leon Kennedy. So beautiful. Even in death, Beverly Harris was radiant. But Irons couldn't risk having her wake up while he wasn't watching. He carefully folded her into the stone cabinet beneath the sink and latched it, promising himself that he would take her out when he had more time. She would become the most exquisite animal that he'd ever transformed, posed and forever perfect once he'd prepared her the proper way. A dream come true. If I have time, if there's any time left. He knew he was feeling sorry for himself again, but there was no one else to commiserate with, no one to marvel at the sheer magnitude of all that he'd suffered. He felt terrible, sad and angry and alone, but he also felt that things had finally become clear. He knew now, knew why he was being persecuted, and that awareness had given him a focus. As depressing as the truth was, at least he was no longer lost. Umbrella. An Umbrella conspiracy to destroy me all along. Irons sat on the scarred, stained table in the sanctuary, his special, private place, and wondered how long it would be before the young woman came for him. The one with the athletic body, the one who'd refused to tell him her name. In a way, she was responsible for his newfound clarity, an irony that he couldn't help but appreciate. It had been her sudden appearance that had provided him with the truth. She would find him, of course. She was an Umbrella spy, and Umbrella had obviously been watching him for quite some time.
They probably had lists of everything he owned, volumes of psychological profiling reports, even copies of his financial records. It all made sense. Now that he'd had some time to think, he was the most powerful man in Raccoon. And Umbrella had designed his downfall, tailored each vicious backstab to cause him the most acute agony possible. Ian stared at his treasures, the tools and trophies that sat on the shelves in front of him, but felt none of the pride they usually inspired. The polished bones were simply something to look at as his mind worked, absorbed with Umbrella's treachery. Years before, when he'd started taking money to turn a blind eye to the company's doings, things had been different. Then it had been a matter of politics, of finding himself a niche in the power structure that really controlled Raccoon. And things had worked smoothly for a long time. His career had progressed on schedule. He'd earned the respect of officials and citizens alike, and for the most part, his investments had paid off. Life had been good. And then there was Birkin. William Birkin and his neurotic wife and their brat daughter. After the Spencer estate spill, he'd almost convinced himself that the Stars and goddamn Captain Wesker had been responsible for all the trouble. But he could see now that it was the arrival of Birkin and his family, nearly a year before, that had started the ball rolling. The destruction of the Spencer lab had only hurried things along. Umbrella had probably started monitoring him the day he'd had the misfortune to meet Birkin. At first, just watching, planting bugs and installing cameras. The spies would have come later. The Birkins had come to Raccoon so that William could concentrate on developing a superior synthesis of the T-virus based on the research being done at the Spencer lab. As quirky and unpleasant as William could sometimes be, Irons had liked him right from the start. The male Birkin had been Umbrella's boy genius, but like Irons, he wasn't the type to brag about his position. William was a humble man, only interested in fulfilling his own potential. They'd both been too busy to have much of a friendship, but there had been a mutual respect between them. Irons had often felt that William looked up to him. And my mistake was to allow it. To allow my regard for him to cloud my instincts, to keep me from noticing that I was being watched all along. The loss of the Spencer lab sent some big ripples through Umbrella's hierarchy, and only days after the explosion, Irons had been approached by Annette Birkin with a message from her husband. A message and a request for a favor. Birkin had been worried that Umbrella was going to demand a new synthesis, the G-virus, before it was ready. Apparently, he'd been most dissatisfied with the application of his previous work. Something about how Umbrella hadn't let him perfect the replication process. Irons couldn't remember exactly. And with Umbrella looking to recover from the financial blow of the Spencer loss, Birkin had been concerned that they might compromise the integrity of the untested virus. Through Annette, Birkin had asked for assistance and offered him a little extra incentive to keep things fair. For $100,000, all Irons had to do was help keep the G-virus under wraps. In short, watch out for Umbrella spies and keep an eye on the surviving Stars, making sure they didn't do any more discovering of Umbrella's research. That was it. $100,000. And I was already watching my city and keeping tabs on that rebellious little pack of troublemakers. Easy. Easy money. And more to be made if everything went as planned. Except it was a trap. An umbrella trap.
Irons had walked right into it, and that was when Umbrella had started plotting against him, using the information they'd gathered to seal his fate. How else could things have gone wrong so quickly? The stars had disappeared, then Birkin. And before he'd even had a chance to assess the situation, the attacks had started up again. He'd barely had time to seal Raccoon off before everything had fallen to shit. All because I was helping a friend. For the greater good of the company, no less. Tragic. Irons stood up and walked slowly around the cutting table, idly tracing the dents and scars in the wood with his fingertips. Behind every mark was a story, a memory of accomplishment. But again, he could take no comfort. The cool, quiet atmosphere of the sanctuary had always soothed him before, and it was where he practiced his hobbies, where he was truly able to be himself. But it wasn't his anymore. Nothing was. Umbrella had taken it from him, just as they'd taken his city. Was it so far-fetched to deduce that they'd unleashed their virus to get at him? To rob him of his power, and then sent that scantily clad, brown-haired girl to rub his nose in it? Why else was she so attractive? They knew his weaknesses, and were exploiting them, trying to keep him from retaining even a shred of dignity. And soon she'll come for me, maybe still playing dumb, still trying to seduce me with her helplessness. An umbrella assassin, a spy and an exploiter. That's all she is, probably laughing at me behind that pretty face. Maybe the spill had been an accident. The last time they'd met, William Birkin had seemed unsteady, paranoid, and exhausted. And accidents happen even under the best of circumstances. But the rest was fact. There was no other explanation for how completely Irons had been ruined. That girl was coming to get him. She was from Umbrella, and she'd been sent to murder him. And she wouldn't stop there. Oh no, she'd find Beverly and defile her somehow, just to make certain that nothing he cared about was left. Irons looked around the small, softly lit room that had once been his, gazing wistfully at the well-used tools and furniture, the sweet, familiar smells of disinfectant and formaldehyde emanating from the rugged stone walls. My sanctuary. Mine. He picked up the handgun that lay on his special cutting table, the VP-70 that was still his, and felt a bitter smile curl his lips. His life was over. He knew that now. The whole affair had started with Birkin and would end here, by his own hand. But not yet. The girl would come for him, and he would kill her before he said his final goodbyes to Beverly, before he admitted his defeat by taking a bullet. But he would see to it that she understood his suffering first. For every torture he'd endured, the girl would pay. The bill settled through flesh and bone and as much pain as he could inflict. He was going to die, but not alone. And not without hearing the girl scream in agony, creating a voice for the death of his dreams. A voice so clear and true that the echoes would reach even the black hearts of the company executives who had betrayed him. The Star's office was empty, cluttered and cold, layered with dust. But Claire was reluctant to leave. After her stumbling, frightened flight through the body-strewn halls of the second floor, finding the place where her brother had spent his working days had left her feeling weak with relief. Mr. X hadn't followed her, and although she was still anxious to help Sherry and find Leon, she found herself lingering, afraid to step back into the lifeless halls and hesitant to leave the one place that felt like Chris. "Where are you, big brother? And what am I going to do? Zombies, fire, death, your weird Chief Irons, and that lost little girl. And just when I thought things couldn't get any more insane, I get to face off with the thing that would not die. The freak to end all freaks. How am I going to get through this?" She sat at Chris's desk, gazing at the small strip of black and white pictures that she'd found tucked in the bottom drawer. The 4 shots were of the 2 of them, grinning and making faces, a photo booth memento of the week they'd spent in New York last Christmas. Finding the strip had made her want to cry at first. All of the fear and confusion she'd been holding back finally surged to the front at the sight of his well-loved smile. But the longer she looked at him, at the 2 of them laughing and having a good time, the better she'd started to feel. Not happy or even okay, and no less afraid of what was to come. Just better, calmer, stronger. She loved him and knew that wherever he was, he loved her back, and that if the 2 of them had been able to survive the loss of both of their parents, to build a life for themselves and share a silly Christmas vacation in spite of having no real home to go to, then they could cope with anything. She could cope. Can and will. I'm going to find Sherry and Leon and, God willing, my brother, and we're going to make it out of Raccoon. The truth was, she didn't really have any choice, but she needed to go through the process of accepting her lack of options before she could act. She'd heard before that real bravery wasn't an absence of fear. It was accepting fear and doing what was necessary anyways. And once she'd sat for a moment, thinking about Chris, she thought that she could do just that. Claire took a deep breath, slipped the photos into a vest, and pushed away from the desk. She didn't know where Mr. X had been headed, but he hadn't seemed like the waiting around type. She would head back to Irons' office and see if Sherry had come back, or Irons for that matter. If X was still there, she could always run. Besides, I have searched this office, tried to find something about the Stars. There's nothing here that can tell me anything. Standing, she took a last look around, wishing that the Stars office had offered a little more in the way of supplies or information. All she'd found of any use was a discarded fanny pack in the desk behind Chris's. According to the expired library card in one of the pouches, it had belonged to Jill Valentine. Claire had never met her, but Chris had mentioned her a couple of times, said she was good with a gun. Too bad she didn't leave one behind. The team had obviously cleared out all of the important stuff after their suspension, although there were still a surprising number of personal items left around, framed pictures and coffee mugs and the like. She'd spotted Barry's desk right away from the partly finished plastic gun model on top. Barry Burton was one of Chris's closest friends, a huge, friendly bear of a man and a serious gun nut. Claire hoped that wherever Chris was, Barry was with him, watching his back, with a rocket launcher. And speaking of, on top of everything else, she needed to find another weapon, or more ammo for the 9mm. She had 13 bullets left, one full clip, and when those were gone, she was SOL. Maybe she should stop and check some of the corpses on the way back to the East Wing. Even in her panicked run, she'd noticed that some of them were cops, and the handgun was an RPD issue. Claire didn't like the idea of touching any of the dead bodies, but running out of firepower was distinctly less desirable, particularly with Mr. X running around. Claire walked toward the door and pushed it open, trying to get her thoughts organized as she stepped back into the dim hall. Leaving the office put a damper on her resolve. She had to suppress a shudder at the still vivid image of Mr. X as she closed the door behind her, suddenly feeling vulnerable again. She turned right and started back toward the library, deciding that she wouldn't think about the giant unless she had to, wouldn't dwell on the memory of those blank, inhuman eyes or the way he'd raised his terrible fists as if driven to destroy anything in his way. So knock it off already. Think about Sherry. Think about getting some goddamn ammo or how to handle irons if you can find him. Think about trying to stay alive. Just ahead, the dark wooden hall turned right again, and Claire tried to steel herself against the task ahead. If memory served, there was a dead cop around the corner, and she'd have to search him. He hadn't been too disgusting. At least, not that she'd noticed. Claire turned the corner and froze, staring. Her stomach knotted, telling her she was in danger before her senses could. The body that she'd jumped over on the way to the Star's office was now only a bloody, tangled mass, flesh and broken limbs and shredded uniform. The head was gone, although there was no way to tell if it had been taken away or just smashed into an unrecognizable pulp. It looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer or an axe to the corpse in the few moments since she'd passed it, beating it into a clotted smear. But when? How? I didn't hear anything. Something moved, a shadow, soft and darting over the mashed remains some 20 feet in front of her. And at the same time, Claire heard a strange rasping sound. Breathing. And she looked up, still not sure what she was seeing or hearing, that ragged breathing and the tick of talons on wood. The talons themselves, thick and curved, the claws of a creature that couldn't exist. Big, the size of a full-grown man, but the resemblance ended there. And it was so impossible that she could only see it in pieces, her mind struggling to put them together. the inflamed purplish flesh of the naked, long-limbed creature that clung to the ceiling, the puffy, gray-white tissue of the partially exposed brain, the scar-rimmed holes where the eyes should have been. Not seeing this. The creature's rounded head dropped back and a wide jaw opened, a ropey stream of dark drool pouring out and splattering over what was left of the cop. It extended its tongue, eely and pink, the rough surface shimmering wetly as it slithered out, and out, and out, the snaking tongue on coiling and whipping from side to side, so long that it actually trailed through the ripped flesh of the corpse. Still frozen, Claire watched in horrified disbelief as the incredible tongue snapped back up, flicking droplets of blood through the shadowy air. The entire process had taken only a second, but time had slowed to a crawl, Claire's heart beating so fast that everything else was in slow motion. Even the creature's drop to the wooden floor, its body flipping in midair so that it landed in a crouch atop the mutilated cop. The creature opened its mouth again and screamed, and Claire was finally able to move as the bizarre hollow shriek erupted from the monster, able to point her weapon and fire. The thunder of 9mm rounds drown out the howl that echoed through the tight hallway. And still screaming that chilling, trumpeting cry, the creature was thrown back, its claw-tipped arms flailing, its spasming legs kicked up bloody chunks of the eviscerated body. Claire saw a ragged flap of scalp, one ear still attached, fly across the hall and smack into the wall with a wet slapping sound, sliding down. And the creature got its legs beneath it somehow and flopped forward in a boneless lunge. It spidered towards her, lightning fast, gripping the wood floor with its terrible claws and howling. Claire fired again, unaware that she was also screaming as 3 more rounds hit the scuttling thing, ripping through the gray matter that protruded from its open skull. She was going to die. It would be on her in less than a second, and its massive talons were only inches from her legs. And as suddenly as the attack had come, it was over. Every part of the sinewy body quivered and shook as liquid gray dribbled from its burbling head, the thick claws tapping wildly against the wood floor in a frantic tattoo. With a final whispering whine, the creature died. There was no mistaking it this time. She'd blasted through its brain. It wasn't going to get up again. She stared down at the monster, her shocked mind digging for something to relate it to, some animal or even a rumor of an animal that came close. But she gave it up after a few seconds, recognizing it as a lost cause. This was no natural creature, and as close as it was, she could finally smell it. The odor was not as pungent as the zombies. It was a bitter, oily smell, somehow more chemical than animal. And it could smell like chocolate chip cookies. Who gives a shit? Raccoon City's got monsters. It's time to stop being so goddamn surprised when you see one of them. The chiding tone of her mind's voice wasn't particularly convincing. As much as she wanted to feel brave and determined to step over the monstrous creature and get on with things, she just stood for a moment. And for that moment, She thought very seriously about going back to the Star's office, going inside and locking the door behind her. She could hide and wait for help. She could be safe. Decide then. Do something one way or another. Stop this wavering and whining because it's not just you anymore. Will Sherry be safe? Do you want to survive at the cost of her life? The moment passed. Claire took a careful step over the raw red flesh of the creature and crouched down next to the cop's remains, using the muzzle of the handgun to push a torn piece of bloodied uniform aside. She swallowed down bile as she poked through the rotten flesh and bone, working not to think about who the cop had been or how he had died. Nothing. And she now had only 7 bullets left. But she refused to panic, letting the disappointment fuel her determination instead. If she could search one bloody mess, she could search another. With a last look at the dead animal thing, Claire stood and walked quickly toward the end of the corridor, her decision made. No hiding, and no more running from the fear. At the very least, she could take a few of the monsters with her, raising Sherry's chances of escape. It would be better to die trying than not to try at all. She wouldn't waver again. Leon found Ada in the kennel, straining to lever up the rusted manhole cover that the reporter had told them about. She'd turned up a crowbar from somewhere and had it wedged beneath the thick iron plate, her well-defined biceps slightly sheened with sweat as she worked the bar. She'd managed to raise the cover about an inch, but let it drop back into place as he walked in, the metallic clang loud in the cold, empty room. Before he could say anything, she laid the crowbar on the cement floor and looked up at him with a strained half-smile, brushing at her rust-dirty hands. "I'm glad you're here. I don't think I'm strong enough to do this by myself." He hadn't been sure before, but the helpless look she gave him cinched it. She was playing him. Or trying to. He'd known Ada for all of 20 minutes, but he doubted seriously that she'd ever been helpless about anything. "Looks like you're doing just fine," he said, holstering the magnum, but not making any move toward the manhole. He crossed his arms, frowning slightly. He wasn't angry, just curious. "Besides, what's the hurry? I thought you wanted to talk to the reporter about John, your umbrella friend." The woman in distress look melted away, and her delicate features turned cool and hard, but not in a bad way. It was as though she was letting her real self show, the strong and self-assured Ada he'd first met. Leon could tell that he'd surprised her by not rushing to her aid, and was glad to see it. He had enough to worry about without being manipulated by a mysterious stranger. She'd been very careful to avoid his questions, but it was time for Miss Wong to explain a few things. Ada stood up, meeting his gaze evenly. "You heard him. He wasn't going to tell us anything. And with this place as dangerous as it is, I don't really want to stand around waiting for him to develop a conscience." She dropped her gaze, her voice softening. "And I don't even know if John's in Raccoon. But I do know he's not here, and I want to leave before the station's completely overrun." It sounded good, but for some reason he had the feeling that she was holding something back. For a few seconds, he struggled to think of a polite way to get her to open up, then decided to hell with it. Under the circumstances, social graces would have to be suspended. "What's going on, Ada? Do you know something that you're not telling me?" She looked at him again. And again he had the feeling that he'd surprised her. But her cool, dark gaze was as unreadable as ever. "I just want to get out of here," she said. And the sincerity of her tone was impossible to deny. If he hadn't believed anything else she'd said, he had to believe that much. "And I wish it were that easy. But there's Claire and even Ben, our asshole friend, and God knows how many others." Leon shook his head. "I can't leave. Like I said, I may be the only cop left around here. If there are still people in the building, I have to at least try to help them. And I think it'd be best if you came with me." Ada gave him another one of her half-smiles. "I appreciate your concern, Leon, but I can take care of myself." He didn't doubt it, but he also didn't want to see her abilities tested. Granted, he was pretty untested himself, but he'd been trained to deal with crisis situations. It was his job. And be honest with yourself. You lost Claire, you couldn't help Brannig, and Ben Bertolucci could give a rat's ass for your protection skills. You don't want to fail with Ada on top of all that. And you don't want to be alone. Ada seemed to know what he was thinking. Before he could come up with a convincing argument, she stepped forward and put one slender hand on his arm, the humor fading from her bright eyes. "I know you want to do your job here, but you said it yourself. We have to find a way out of Raccoon, try and get outside help. And the sewers are probably the best chance we've got." The light, gentle touch surprised him and sent an electric flutter through his belly, an unexpected flush of warmth that left him feeling confused and uncertain. He'd managed to keep his reaction from showing, but just barely. Ada continued, frowning thoughtfully. "How about this? Help me with the manhole cover. Let's see what's down there. If it looks dangerous, I'll come with you. But if it's not bad, we can talk about what to do next." He wanted to protest, but the truth was he couldn't make her do anything she didn't want to do, and he very much wanted for her to know that he wasn't some overbearing macho type, that he was receptive to compromise. "And does the name John ring a bell? This isn't a date, for Christ's sakes. Stop thinking with your hormones." Feeling awkward even thinking about it, with her hand still on his arm, Leon stepped away, nodding briskly. Together they crouched down next to the manhole. Leon picked up the crowbar and jammed one end beneath the lid. As he pulled back, Ada pushed on the bar, and with a heavy grating sound, the thick metal plate came up. Leon put his back into it and heaved the lid to one side, clearing the opening. And both of them recoiled back from the smell that bellowed out of the dark hole, a choking dark stench of blood and piss and vomit. "What is that?" Leon coughed. Ada sat back on her heels, one hand pressed to her mouth. "The bodies from the garage." They must have dumped them down here. Before he could ask what she was talking about, a scream of pure terror echoed through the basement halls, filtering through the closed doors. The cry went on, a man's voice, the panicked scream suddenly changing to a gurgling shriek of pain. The reporter. Leon locked gazes with Ada, saw the same startling realization flash across her face, and then they were both up and running, pulling out their weapons and sprinting through the door before the echoes died. I left him. I shouldn't have left him. They ran down the corridor for the cell block, guilt driving Leon to run faster than he thought he could. Someone, or something, had gotten to Bertolucci and had passed right behind his back to do it. Sherry stood in Mr. Ryan's office, rubbing at her good luck pendant and wishing that Claire would come back. She had crawled through a dozen dusty tunnels to get away from the monster and to lead it away from Claire, and was pretty sure it had worked. She hadn't heard it again, and had come back to find that Claire had left. If the monster had found her, she would have been dead and ripped apart. Sherry sat on the edge of a low table in the middle of the room, wondering what she should do. She'd gotten used to being alone and hadn't even realized how lonely she'd been. But meeting Claire had changed that. Sherry wanted to see her again. She wanted to be with the other people. She wanted her parents so bad that it made her ache. Even Mr. Ryans would be okay, although Sherry didn't like him. She'd only met him a couple of times, but he was weird, showy and fake, and his office was creepy. Still, she'd gladly put up with him if it meant she didn't have to be alone anymore. Footsteps in the hall outside of the office. Sherry stood up and ran to the open door that led back to the armor room, hoping it was Claire and ready to sprint for cover if it wasn't. She ducked around the doorframe and held her breath, staring at the stuffed tiger in the hall and silently praying. The outer door opened and closed. Muffled steps on the carpet, moving slowly, and she tensed to run, at the same time trying to muster up enough courage to sneak a look. Sherry? Claire! I'm here! She ran back into the office, and there was Claire, her whole face lit up with a beaming smile. Sherry flew into her open arms, so happy to see her that she wanted to cry. I was looking for you, Claire said, holding her tightly. Don't run off like that again. Claire knelt in front of her, still smiling, but Sherry could see the worry behind the smile and in her cool gray eyes. I'm sorry, Sherry said. I had to, or the monster would have come. What does it look like? Claire asked, her smile fading. Does it look kind of red with claws? Sherry swallowed heavily. The Inside Out men. You saw one, didn't you? Incredibly, Claire grinned, shaking her head. Yeah, that's exactly what I saw. An Inside Out man. Good description. She looked at Sherry more seriously. Men? There are more of them? Sherry nodded. Yes, but they aren't anything like the monster. I only saw him once from behind. But he's a man. A giant man. Claire seemed excited. Bald? Wearing a long coat? No, he had hair. Brown hair. and one of his arms was all screwed up, a lot longer than the other one. Claire sighed. Terrific. Raccoon's got something for everyone. She reached out and took Sherry's hand, squeezing it. And that's all the more reason that you should stay with me. You've done a really good job of taking care of yourself, and you've been very brave, but until we find your parents, I feel like it's my job for now to watch out for you. And if the monster comes, I'll just kick its ass. Sherry laughed, surprised into it. She liked that Claire didn't talk down to her. She nodded, and Claire squeezed her hand again. Good. So we've got zombies, inside-out men, and a monster, and a big bald guy. Sherry, do you know what happened to Raccoon? How this all got started? Anything you can tell me, anything at all. It could be important. Sherry frowned, thinking, well, there were a bunch of murders last May or June, I think. Like 10 people got killed. And then they stopped. But then maybe a week ago, somebody got attacked. Claire nodded encouragingly. Okay. Did more people start getting attacked, or what did the police do? Sherry shook her head, wishing she could be more helpful. I don't know. Right before that girl got attacked, my mother called from work really upset and told me I couldn't leave the house. Mrs. Willis, that's our next-door neighbor, she came over and cooked dinner for me, and that's how I heard about that girl. Mum called again the next day and told me that she and Dad were stuck at the plant and wouldn't be home for a while. And then like 3 days ago, she called again and told me to come here. I went to see if Mrs. Willis would come with me, but her house was dark and empty. I guess things had already gotten pretty bad by then. Claire was staring at her intently. You were all alone? All that time? Even before you got to the station? Sherry nodded. Well, yeah, but I stay alone a lot. My parents are both scientists. Their work is important, and sometimes they can't stop in the middle of what they're doing. And my mother always says that I'm very self-sufficient when I want to be. Do you know what kind of work your parents do at Umbrella? Claire was still watching her closely. They develop cures for things, for diseases, Sherry said proudly, and make medicines, like serums that hospitals use. She trailed off, noticing that Claire seemed distracted suddenly, her gaze far away. It was a look she had seen plenty of times before on both her parents' faces, and it meant that they weren't really listening anymore. But as soon as she stopped talking, Claire refocused on her, reaching out to pat her on the shoulder, and for some stupid reason that made Sherry want to cry again. Because she's listening to me. Because she wants to watch out for me. Your mother's right, Claire said gently. You're very self-sufficient, and that you've made it this far means that you're also very strong. And that's good, because we're both going to have to be strong to make it out of here. Sherry felt her eyes go wide. What do you mean? Leave the station? But there are zombies all over the place, and I don't know where my parents are. What if they need help or they're looking for me? Sweetie, I'm sure your folks are just fine, Claire said quickly. They're probably still at the plant, hiding and safe, just like you were, waiting for people to come from outside of the city to To make everything better. You mean kill everything, Sherry said. I'm 12, you know. I'm not a baby. Claire smiled. Sorry, yeah, to kill everything. But until the good guys come, we're on our own. And the best thing we can do, the smartest thing, is to get out of their way. To get as far out of their way as possible. You're right, the streets aren't safe, but maybe we can get a car. It was Claire's turn to trail off. She stood up and walked toward the big desk at the far end of the office, looking around as she went. Maybe Chief Irons left his car keys here, or another weapon, something we can use. Claire saw something on the floor behind the desk. She crouched down and Sherry hurried after her, as much to stay close as to see what she'd found. She already knew that she didn't want to lose her again, no matter what else happened. There's blood here, Claire said softly. So softly that Sherry thought she hadn't meant to say it out loud. So? Claire looked up at the plain tan wall, frowning, then back down at the big drying splotch of red on the floor. It's still wet, for one thing. And see the way it's just cut off? There should be something on the wall here. She rapped on the dark wood trim that lined the wall, then on the wall itself. There was an obvious difference, a dull thump from the trim, but the wall sounded hollow. Is there a room back there? Sherry asked. I don't know. It sounds like it, and it would explain where he took off to earlier. Chief Irons, I mean. She glanced up at Sherry as she started to feel along the baseboards, running her hands up the wall and pushing at it. Sherry, look around the desk. See if you can find, like, a switch or a lever. My guess is it would be hidden somewhere, maybe in one of the drawers. Sherry started to move behind the desk and tripped, her foot sliding on a handful of pencils that she hadn't seen. She grabbed at the desktop, trying to catch her balance, but still came down pretty hard on her bare knees. Ow! Claire was next to her right away, putting an arm around her shoulders. Are you okay? Yeah, Hey, look! Her bruised knees forgotten, Sherry pointed at the switch under the top drawer of the desk, set into a small metal plate. It looked like a light switch, but it had to be for the secret door. She just knew it. Claire reached out and flipped the switch, and behind them a section of the wall a few feet across slid smoothly upwards, disappearing into the ceiling and exposing a dimly lit room lined with oversized bricks. Cool, damp air breezed into the office. It was a secret passage, just like in the movies. Together they stood and stepped toward the opening, Claire holding Sherry back with one arm until she'd looked first. The small room was totally empty. 3 brick walls and a stained wood floor, and only about half the size of the office. The 4th wall was dominated by a big old-fashioned elevator gate, the kind that pushed to one side. Are we going to take it? Sherry asked. She was excited but nervous. Claire had taken her gun out. She crouched down next to Sherry and smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile, and Sherry knew what was coming before Claire said a word. Sweetie, I think it would be safest if I went and looked around first, and you stayed here. But you said we should stay together. You said we could find a car and leave. What if the monster comes back and you're not here, or you get killed?" Claire hugged her, but Sherry felt almost sick with helpless anger. She was going to tell her not to worry, that the monster wouldn't come, that nothing bad would happen, and then she was going to leave anyways. Stupid grown-up lies. Claire leaned back, smoothing Sherry's hair away from her face. "I don't blame you for being scared. I'm scared too. This is a bad situation, and honestly, I don't know what's going to happen. But I want to do the right thing, by you. And that means that I'm not going to take you into a situation where you could get hurt. Not if I can help it." Sherry swallowed back tears, trying again. "But I want to come with you. What if you don't come back?" "I'm going to come back," Claire said firmly. "I promise. And if I don't, I want you to hide again, like before. Somebody will come. Help is going to come, and they'll find you." At least she was being honest. Sherry didn't like it, not at all. But at least there was that, and from the look on her face, Sherry could see that there was nothing she could say to change her mind. She could be a baby about it, or she could accept it. "Be careful," she whispered, and Claire hugged her again before standing and moving towards the elevator. She pushed a button next to the gate, and there was a low, soft hum. After a few seconds, an elevator car rose into view, coming to a gentle stop. Claire pulled the gate open and stepped inside, turning for a last look at Sherry. "Stay here, sweetie," she said. "I'll be back in a few minutes." Sherry forced herself to nod, and Claire let the gate close. She touched something inside the elevator, and the car went down, her smiling, strong face descending out of sight, leaving Sherry by herself in the cold, dark passage. Sherry sat down on the dusty floor and hugged her knees close to her body, rocking herself slowly. Claire was brave and smart. She'd be back soon. She had to come back. "I want my mummy," Sherry whispered. But there was nobody to hear. She was alone again, the thing she wanted least of all. "But I'm strong. I'm strong, and I can wait." She rested her chin on one knee, touching the necklace her mother had given her for good luck, and started to wait for Claire to come back.